Let's start by, I suppose, considering what is family history. Well, my approach is that it's based on a very simple but powerful idea that every person has a story that is worth knowing and keeping for posterity. In the past, most genealogists looked only at the line of descent. And this approach has obvious flaws. If you leave out the women, you lose half the family narrative. But I'm also going to encourage you to try and recover in your own research the stories of all family members, even the ones that didn't leave descendants, because their stories are part of your family story too. The inspiration for this class came to me during the first lockdown back in March, April 2020. Lockdown coincided with the spring clear out. And with probably less distraction from the outside world, I took a deeper dive than usual. I think this was a fairly common experience. I know from talking to my friends and to the people I'm in contact with regularly, it certainly seemed to be. I found this quote from one of my favorite writers who described what she did. Margaret Atwood described it as photo sorting, purging old files, delving into storage trunks, wondering at some of the things that were found there, asking, why did I save that? And what exactly is it? Reading old letters. Now this really struck a chord with me because it's exactly what I did. And even as I was clearing, I had to continuously make decisions about what I should keep and what to throw away. You see, we accumulate the flotsam and jetsam of everyday living over the years. We hold on to some documents because we need them for personal administration, legal use, births, marriages, and death certificates, for example, or a will, or house deeds. We hold on to other things because they have a personal resonance, photographs, letters, keepsakes. Consequently, we all of us have a lot of evidence for family history stored in our own homes, within our own four walls. Let's start with the first source. One of the features of modern life is a huge increase in bureaucracy and personal administration. We all have personal paperwork on file. Some of the most important legal documents are, of course, births, marriages, and deaths, civil or vital records. You have to have a birth certificate to apply for a children's allowance or to enroll your child at school or university. We require a death certificate if you want to take out probate on a will. Civil records are also an acceptable form of ID to apply for a driver's license, a public services card, or a state pension. Civil records are public records. They're among the easiest of all to find and to interpret. And they are the building blocks of family history research. Most of you will probably only have civil records for 2 generations at home, you and your own kids. Since 2015, however, the state published online historic civil records. So they're more accessible now than they ever have been via your own home computer or even your tablet. The website is irishgenealogy.ie, and here you will find births, marriages, and deaths for people of all classes and all religious faiths from 1864. Marriages for non-Catholics from April 1845. And this, of course, also includes interfaith marriages, accounting for about a third of all marriages that took place in Ireland from 1845 onwards. Start in April 1845, I should say. Now, there is a cut-off date for the online records to protect the privacy of living people, and that is 1920 for birth records, 1945 for marriages, and 1969 for deaths. Now, after 1922, Partition of the island created two separate jurisdictions, and records for the 6 counties of Northern Ireland are online, GRONI, Grony, and they have similar cut-off dates. So whether your family are from County Down or County Louth, either side of the border, you will be able to find many of these civil records online. When it comes to personal paperwork, I tend to keep everything, including school reports and artwork. Now, unless my children do something spectacular and have biographies written about them, and by the way, I'm not expecting that at all, but this level of evidence will probably never be required. But it has a personal resonance to me and to their father, and they may like to look over it again at some point in the future. In fact, one of the fastest growing hobbies in the States is scrapbooking. It's a way to conserve personal ephemera, so it can be shared within a family. We can look back, we can review what we did or what our children did, maybe 50 years hence. The next classification of evidence I want to look at are keepsakes and artifacts. Almost every family has keepsakes and artifacts passed down generations because they have a story attached. A friend of mine, his ancestors worked for the Ordnance Survey in the 1830s, and almost 200 years later, his family still has the chain used to measure field boundaries. One of my students in Trinity showed me a book owned by an ancestor of his in the 1820s. The man was a school teacher. It has his name, his townland address, and the date when he first acquired it. And again, this is something which has been kept within the family and passed down. It's something which has treasured, but most importantly, it actually has a story attached to it. In this decade of centenaries, some of the most common historic artifacts kept as heirlooms in Irish families relate to World War I, or to the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War. The Military Archives of the Irish Defence Force has a new booklet and a database for the people who received medals issued for service 1916 to 1923. And I've included online the URL for that database if you actually want to go and take a look. In the 19th and early 20th century, many Irish men enlisted in the British Armed Services. Now, where families emigrated, Irish-born sons and brothers and husbands might have fought for the US or the Canadian Defence Forces. Many families have medals awarded generations earlier, but which are kept within the family and passed down. These are medals for military service, for service in particular campaigns, and sometimes for personal valour. One of the most common heirlooms that I've seen are the bronze death pennies. These were sent to the family of every serviceman that was killed during World War I. Other artifacts include items that we would call trench art. Soldiers made decorative items from the raw material found on or about the battlefield. The most common material, of course, that was available to soldiers would have been the spent artillery shells and gun cases. One of my neighbours, an elderly man whose granddad was in World War I, has an umbrella stand made from a tank shell. It's just there right beside the door. And I saw it, I called around at Christmas with a present, and as I was leaving, I saw it by the door. I've also seen coal scuttles, again made from spent shells. And on screen is it's a form of trench art that I find especially poignant. It's a crucifix made from spent bullet cases. One of the more unusual artifacts or keepsakes that I came across during research was a baby's caul. Now, babies born in the caul are thought to be protected against drowning. It was an old kind of folk belief. And I came across a caul. The caul on the screen is one that I took from it's an image from the Pitt River Museum in Oxford University. But I was researching the family history of one client, and they showed me an artifact, a family heirloom. And this was a birth caul. The birth caul belonged to Willie Scanlon. He was born in 1911 in Limerick. The midwife attending the birth gathered the caul, she wound it around a piece of cardboard, and she gave it to the child's mother. Now, 20 years or so later, the mother gave her son a wallet containing money and the caul when he left for England. Willie settled in England, and in 1940, he enlisted in the British Army. He was evacuated from Dunkirk. He took part in the maritime invasion of Sicily. His mother always swore he survived because he carried his birth caul with him. This is a picture of Willie and the other chaplains in the 8th Army. That's him picked out there. Now, this is kind of a strange fusion of religion and folk tradition blended in one family, or in one family artifact. It's quite possible I wouldn't have believed this story, except for the fact that the artifact is still in the family's possession. So in a sense, it anchors the story. The fact that it survives, it gives the story a substance, that it's very probable that it did happen in the way in which it was described. Now, where a family stays in the same place, ideally in the same house, the house isn't sold and the family continue to live there, we will sometimes find collections of letters and postcards. Now, in tonight's talk, I've actually focused on postcards. The first postcards appeared in the 1870s. They were sold with prepaid postage. The first postcards were plain cards. You wrote the message on one side, you wrote the address on the other. By the early 1900s, with advances in printing technology, we begin to see the first picture postcards. In my family, I have a collection of postcards sent by my father in the 1950s from Singapore and Hong Kong, and as he made his way around the world. My dad served in the British Merchant Navy. The postcards were sent home to his sister. My dad was at that time unmarried. And his sister, my aunt, now in her 80s, when she was cleaning out the family home, found them and decided to give them to me. I suppose in a sense I have become sort of a family archivist within our extended family. Let's look at another source, another kind of evidence that we find. Photography. Photographs are some of our most prized personal possessions. They don't, as a rule of thumb, have a resale value, but they're irreplaceable if they are lost or destroyed. Photography as we know it was invented after 1839, and it developed on two tracks: professional commercial photography, which usually took place in studios, and as an amateur pastime by the wealthy, leisured classes. Technology moves quite quickly, and within 50 years, photography was accessible to ordinary working people. The first Kodak box camera was introduced in 1888. After World War I, snapshots became a regular feature of family life. Photography changed the way we see ourselves. It also changed the way we like to present ourselves to others and to the greater world. In this earlier time, in the early days of photography, families were much more likely to use photographs to commemorate important occasions, christenings or coming of age, engagements, weddings and funerals. Families dressed up to visit a studio, to capture an image that they wanted to show to the world. Group photographs were very popular, photographs where you represented more than one generation of a family, either male or female. Now, the photograph on screen at the moment was taken about 1902, and it captures 4 generations of one family. At the very center, we see a great-grandmother. She was born about, I think, 1825. To her left, to our right, we see a grandmother. The lady was born about 1850. To the left of your screen, you will see her daughter, the young mother, born about 1876 or thereabouts. And sitting on the great-grandmother's knee is the great-granddaughter, who was about a year old at the time that this photograph was taken. This photograph belongs to my mother-in-law. It's her Atwood family. And it's kind of a neat thing to have, 4 generations of one family. Now, when I first saw this, it was something which was uncommon to me, but since then I've looked at the family photographs of many of the people that I've worked with, and I've seen similar kinds of themes running through their photo collections. It's kind of a lovely thing to see. Almost every home has a collection of family photographs, passed down through 1 or more generations. Different processes made different types, different formats of photograph. And knowing the kind of print that you have can help you to pin a date as to when it was taken. And I'm going to go through these different types of prints now. Daguerreotypes were some of the first used in the 1840s and 50s. These were photo images made directly onto a silvered copper plate. They were quite expensive to take. They would have cost, in the 1840s, they could cost as much as £10. So they were pretty much limited to the very wealthy. Ambrotypes was the first cheaper kind of photograph that was widely available. These typically cost £2. So they were still beyond the reach of the ordinary working person, but they were well within the reach of most of the middle classes. Ambrotypes used glass plate negatives. Both daguerreotypes and ambrotypes produced unique once-off plates. Now, if you look at the image on screen, you'll see that the glass is broken. We can see the negative image of the woman's arm, which has been lost now because we no longer have the negative printed directly onto the plate. This is a carte de visite. It's a process by which several small negatives were printed onto one card. The prints were then cut and pasted onto card mounts, usually the size of a visiting card. These could be mass-produced, and in fact this was the most popular form of photography in the Victorian era. Tintypes produced simple images, but they were much cheaper to produce. They tended to be aimed at the popular end of the market. Tintype photography was often used at seaside resorts and by itinerant photographers. It was very popular in America, where it's used from the 1860s onwards. It doesn't make its way to this side of the Atlantic until the 1880s. Now, we saw the introduction of postcards in the 1870s. After 1902, portrait postcards became one of the most popular formats. And this continued to be used right into the late 1940s. If you look on screen, this picture is a photograph in my own family collection. This photograph of a young couple in an old jalopy was taken in 1922 in a studio in New York City. I'll show you the address on the back of the photograph, 947 Amsterdam Avenue, New York. Using a commercial directory for New York City, I found out who lived at this address, and I was able to identify the couple, or at least the lady in the couple, the lady who appears, the lady among the couple who appears in this photograph. The woman in this picture is my great aunt, Margaret Fitzsimons, born November 1892 in Nobber, County Meath. She emigrated to New York and lived on Amsterdam Avenue with her Martin aunts. She's pictured here with her fiancé, Richard Carew. The picture is all the more poignant because Margaret died shortly after it was taken. This is her gravestone. She's buried with her Martin maiden aunts. And the keen-eyed among you who have read to the end of the inscription will see that in 1937, Margaret's former fiancé, Richard Carew, when he died, he was buried with them. Now, this is another example of a postcard portrait, but this one was taken not in the studio, but out in the street. In Easter 1916, many Dublin businesses were interrupted by the Rising. They lost a week's earnings when the Rising broke out. This photographer, who had a studio in Richmond Street in Dublin city centre, decided to take his camera out into the street and to record what was happening on any given day. He photographed the British soldiers there, and he sold them the pictures. This picture is part of a small collection passed by descent in the same family. Formal studio photographs would have been considered the best and the most superior of all photographic forms. Now, this photograph and the next one are studio photographs of the same young woman taken in the 1920s. I worked with a family. I was researching their family history as a commission, and they thought initially it was their grandmother, but as a matter of fact, it turned out to be one of her friends. But it was still a photograph that had been passed down in the family collection, and there were stories attached to it. Now, of course, the most common format of photographs that we have are amateur snapshots. Here's some pictures taken from my own collection. These photos record the everyday life of my family and their friends over 3 generations. The very last source, the very last kind of evidence that I want to look at this evening are family stories. We're all experts in our own family history. We've acquired it by osmosis since we were children, in the places we grew up and the people that we grew up knowing. Our grandparents, our aunts, uncles, cousins, even distant relatives. We have visited in each other's houses. We've met regularly at family events, weddings and funerals. Sometimes we've met at community events, and I'm thinking here of the Pattern Day, when the graves are dressed and blessed. In the countryside, the Pattern Day is a feature of Irish life for people of all faith communities and backgrounds. Now, we very often learn from meeting other family members, family stories that that explain who we are, give us some context to who we are and where we have come from. As a child, I used to love asking my granny what life was like in the good old days. Now, when I first asked her that, she would have been in her 50s. I'm in my 50s now, and I would think it the height of cheek to be asked such a question. But she tolerated me, and she also was a great storyteller. I only wish I had the knowledge and the wherewithal to have been able to tape the conversations that we had. I'm going to present to you a set of guidelines that I have put together over the last 25 years to try and help you record your own family stories. First, start by asking yourself, who are the witnesses to your family story? Draw up a list of who it is you want to talk to and what it is you want to talk to them about. Don't limit yourself to one person, because no one person knows all of the story. Get in touch with them. Set a date to talk with them on a one-to-one basis. Ask if you can tape the conversation, if you can tape the interview. If they agree, you can very quickly build up your own sound archive or library. Remember, though, that if you intend to publish any part of the interview, even in a small family history journal or as a blog or in a booklet, you will have to get written permission to use it. When you meet to talk, use visual prompts. Old photographs are a wonderful way to try and unlock memories. You can sometimes kill two birds with one stone by asking your relative, the person that you are interviewing, if they can name and describe the people in a picture, if you're not sure who exactly it is. Now, if you have this, I like to write this in pencil on the back of the photograph so that the information survives and can be passed on to the next person. If you haven't met the person you're interviewing for quite a while, make sure you're up to speed with what's happening in their lives. Find out if they may have, since you last saw them, married or possibly separated or divorced or been widowed. The thing is, you don't want to put your foot in it. You don't want to ruin the possibility of a good interview by getting off to a bad start. The success of the interview can often rely on a shared sense of family and trust. Prepare your questions in advance so you have a structure to the conversation. Listen carefully to what it is they have to say. Don't be afraid to move away from your prepared questions, especially if they tell you something that you didn't know before. I always like to keep the interview short. 30 minutes is good. You don't want it to become a chore for the person that you're interviewing or for yourself, because remember, you're going to have to transcribe this. When you finish, thank them and ask if you can check back with them to clarify anything or possibly to fact check. Now, once you've taped an interview, you have to transcribe it. And this is very time consuming. For every hour of taped interview, it usually takes me 6 hours to transcribe. So even half an hour is probably going to take you 2.5 to 3 hours to set down on paper. But I really believe that it is essential that you do this. It's the only way that you can really fix the facts firmly in your own mind. Now, if you're like me, it's probably only in the transcribing that you may realize that you have in fact missed a prompt. And this is why it's a good idea to ask at the conclusion, at the end of the interview, if you can come back to them with any further questions. If you think the person has even more good information, you can also ask, I should say, for a second interview at this time. Now, don't pester them if they say no. Allow a proper interval before you ask again. I've also found that it can really help to, I suppose, raise the sense of well-being if you bring along a gift with you, a cake, or sometimes a bottle. I have seen somebody bring with them a bottle of sloe gin, and I have seen that it really actually opened up the conversation, the idea of sitting down over a shared glass of spirits. Now, of course, once you've typed up the interview transcript, you are left with the evidence. And this is where you begin to weigh up the evidence and where you get to play the family detective. The first question I ask myself is the story told by an eyewitness, somebody who was there, or is it hearsay? My mother was at the GPO in 1916, and she told me that she saw. Now, this is very similar to the distinction between primary and secondary sources. Does the story that you hear, does it agree with or contradict stories told by other family members? Some people are scared of where the family stories diverge, but personally, I love this. I love it because where the family stories differ, that's usually where you find the really interesting tales. Look back through the transcript. Ask, does the story that is told include facts or events or dates that you can independently verify? Background events can anchor the story. They can give it more substance, and sometimes they can allow you to pin a date where none has been provided. If you're told, for example, that something happened at the time of the Dublin lockout, you can pin it down to 1913. If it happened during the time of the Fenian Rising, you can pin it down to 1867. The famine is a bit more difficult because it has a time frame, 1845 to 51. But to give you a story, to give you a sense of how you can actually use these family stories, I was one time told by an American client, I sat down with them at the very beginning of their family history, and they began by telling me that their family left Ireland in the 1890s, that they were actually forced out when their horse won the Derby in sometime in the 1890s, and the Black and Tans were very annoyed because their horse came in second, and so they forced them out. Now, I immediately knew that this was not, in fact, a story that was anchored in truth. This was, in fact, a shaggy dog story that was told to entertain a child, for the simple reason that the Black and Tans are present in Ireland in the 1919-1920 timeframe. So a good 20 to 30 years before the time when this American client's family had, in fact, emigrated. Now, the transcript that you have is your raw material. Once you have it, you can begin to mine it for evidence, and you can extract individual stories, and you can begin to shape them and to start to include them, to write them into your own family history, clearly citing them as oral traditions. And the form of citation that is usually accepted by the universities is per person. And this will also allow later generations to see that that is the source that your story came from. Per person, and you will identify. So per person, Fiona Fitzsimons. I heard it from Fiona. It will allow the person coming afterwards to see the source of the evidence. Okay, I am going to finish there. Now, I hope that in the course of this talk, I have managed to persuade you that much of the evidence you need to start your own research will in fact be found within the four walls of your own home. The personal documents, the artifacts and keepsakes, the old letters, the photo collections, and the family stories that we have all grown up with. I'm going to finish here.